after the Battle of Little Bighorn, we have this seminal moment where Congress puts all this money towards getting somewhat revenge for what happened to Custer, but really just trying to solve the problem, trying to make certain that these violent clashes don't keep happening. Now, we've talked about one way that the federal government has tried to keep the settlers and Native Americans separated. Remember, what was that system? What did they call it? Moved them to reservations. Now, again, I want to just touch on this because we're going to see this system really coming about in the early 1800s all the way to the present. Now again, the idea behind this reservation system is simply, we need to move the Native Americans out of the way of white settlers. There continues to be these violent clashes. We have to stop the violence. What the federal government says is simply, well, we have to just keep these groups apart. We have to simply take these Native Americans and keep moving them out of the way of settlers. We need to pick them up and move them west. Now, I do want to tell you this real fast because I think this does a really good job explaining. This right here is a map of one Native American tribe and their continued movement westward, starting all the way back in the mid-1700s. This is a map of the Cherokee tribe. They are picked up and moved westwards. Now, once they're moved westward, what are the settlers doing? Moving westward. So, you pick them up, you move them again. By the late 1700s, what are the settlers doing? Moving westward. You pick them up, you move them again. Again. They even moved shortly into Texas and into Oklahoma by the later 1800s. This has been over 100 years of simply moving them westward. Now let's kind of tie this back to the idea of manifest destiny. What does manifest destiny always say? You have to move from Atlantic to Pacific. So if the idea is simply to keep moving them westward out of the way of these settlers, eventually you're going to run out of space. Eventually, there's not going to be another place to go westwards. Eventually, you need a different idea. Simply picking them up and moving them out of the way cannot perpetuate forever. Something else has to happen. Now, it's really by the late 1800s into the early 1900s that the federal government says, we got to come up with another idea. We got to do something else. By the late 1800s, the federal government starts to say, instead of moving them out of the way of white settlers, why don't we simply bring them in to our culture? Why don't we assimilate these Native Americans? Now, I need to ask real fast, have you heard of this phrase, assimilation, before? How would we describe what assimilation is then? What takes place? Well, guess what? Okay, excellent. It's a great place to start it off. Something else.
Like leaving your culture in order to fit into.
Excellent. Where you simply are going to pick up the social norms of what's considered to be the dominant culture. Wherever you are, that culture, you simply try to fit into that other culture. Now, I will tell you this. I have lived in Colorado almost my whole life. I understand just the way things work here, what's normal for us, what just our culture dictates. One of my brothers is an international pilot, and he flies into Asia basically once a week. He used to live in Hong Kong with his wife and his two very young children. Now, this was years ago. So there's something that he and his family learned in Hong Kong very quickly. My brother is basically a carbon copy of me. We are very, very similar. He has a little boy and a little girl. And when he moved to Hong Kong, let me think. My little nephew was about 5 years old, and my little niece was about 2. These 2 young children have like platinum blonde hair, like white. They step off the plane in Hong Kong, and things are a little bit different. They are the only blonde children for miles. They found something out about Hong Kong culture really fast. There is this little trait in Hong Kong where if you find someone with blonde hair, you rub their head for good luck. Here comes a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old getting off the plane, walking through the jetway into the airport of Hong Kong, and as my brother tells me, everyone kind of looked over and went, it's a leprechaun. Here's everyone just rubbing their heads and then walking away. In the United States, that's assault. All right? That's a felony. Here we have these 2 young ones and my brother taking them to the airport and everyone's going, oh, see you later. You can't do that. You can't go to a 5-year-old, rub them on the head, and then walk away and just be like, ooh, it's gonna be a good day today. That's not how it works here. They go through the Hong Kong airport, and my brother said, every step, there was just someone else. Someone else walks by, hey, all right. You can't do that here. After a while, as my brother tells the story, my nephew got really sick of it. So he wore a hat every day for 5 years they were there. My little niece loved it. She was a movie star. Whenever she went out, just, hey, you want to rub my head for good luck? Hey, all right, see you later. Anyone else? Here we go. Okay. She had the worst just bedhead for 5 years. She was 7 years old, comes back to America, and she goes, people aren't rubbing my head anymore. It's like, good. They're not supposed to. She goes, I kind of miss it. Okay. Really? I think that would be the strangest thing. Everyone, wherever you go, coming up to you and just rubbing your bleach blonde hair wherever you go. This is just something that my little niece fit into the culture. My little nephew, it did not go well. What this idea of assimilation is you gotta fit in. Now, what the federal government decides to do when they say, let's assimilate these people into American culture, they say, we need to start early. We are going to send Native American children to boarding schools. Now, let's kind of connect some dots here, but before we do that, let me ask. Is it fantastically expensive to send a child to boarding school? Yes. Huge expense. Now think of the numbers here. It's literally thousands upon thousands of Native American children being sent to boarding school. Awfully expensive? Yes. Now I need to say this too. Are these Native American children getting an education they could have never gotten either on the reservation or just on planes in years previous? Yes. So let me kind of say it like this. Is the federal government doing this to be mean? There's going to be another side to it, though. By taking these children off of the reservations, away from their families, and putting them in boarding schools to receive an education, what the federal government is doing is they're learning American culture. They're learning American norms. They're taking U.S. history. They're taking government classes. They're learning American heroes. What are they not learning? No, they have math in there too. What's the downside to this? What is it?
They're not learning their own culture, their own language.
Excellent. They're being taken out of their culture and put into traditional American boarding schools. The federal government is, quote unquote, Americanizing these children. Now, I have for you, just as a perfect example, this was a kid about 12 years old. When he came to the boarding school, he looked like this. Now, let's kind of look at this through the lenses of being late 1800s. This child shows up at the boarding school. What do you think they say about this child?
You look cool.
This is not how we do things here. We're going to cut your hair. We're going to put you in a suit. This is how you fit into society. This is assimilation. Now, it goes beyond just sending these children to boarding schools. There's something else the federal government's going to do in order to assimilate Native Americans, to bring them into society. Congress is going to pass what's called the Dawes Act. Now, this again is in the late 1800s, where Congress says, if you're going to fit into our culture, you need to understand one of the basic things of our society. You need to learn how private property works. You need to be able to get this so we don't have this huge misunderstanding anymore. What the Dawes Act does is it takes that giant chunk of communal land that was the reservation and divides it up. It puts it into individual plots of property. Now, each of those lots is going to be handed to the head of every household. So every immediate family gets one piece of the reservation. Now I should ask, what does this do to that idea of communal property? It destroys it. It takes that once just vast open reservation land and turns it into just individual pieces of private property. The communal lands that Native Americans had known is now broken down. Now again, I do kind of have to play this side. Is the federal government doing this to be mean? No. They are saying this is what the culture has. This is how private property works. Now, we were talking before about how private property can be fantastically valuable. It's the most valuable thing that I own, is the property that my house is on and my house itself. Without a doubt. What the federal government is saying here is, we're trying to give you chunks of land that now belongs to you. Whatever work you put into it, whatever improvements you make, you reap the benefits.